Dr. Sharon S. Nazarian works to fight anti-Semitism and racial hatred globally, including in Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. In May 2024, she served as the inaugural Gall Hodges Burt Distinguished Fellow in Policy at the American Academy in Berlin, where she actively researched the intersection of anti-Semitism and the degradation of democratic institutions worldwide. Sharon is a board member of the Anti-Defamation League and the ADL's former Senior Vice President of International Affairs, meeting with heads of state, foreign ministers, and leaders of Jewish communities across the globe. Sharon sits on the Board of Governors of Haifa University, is a member of the Israel Democracy Institute, sits on the National Board of Freedom House, and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Sharon is also an academic and the founder and chair of the advisory board of the Eunice and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA and is president of the Eunice and Soraya Nazarian Family Foundation. Sharon also serves as a Moment Institute Senior Fellow. Joining Sharon today is Moment's Editor-in-Chief Nadine Epstein. Please welcome Sharon Nazarian and Nadine Epstein.
I'm here with my friend and Moment Institute Fellow, Sharon Nazarian, and we're going to talk today about what's happening in Iran. And I have a few things in particular that I want to ask you about. I've been thinking a lot about the Jewish community in Iran. And I know you grew up in the Jewish community in Iran, but you've been here for a few decades already. But have you been in touch with people? Are you aware of how they're doing?
First of all, Nadine, thank you again and Moment Magazine for having me on. It's just such an opportunity for me to be able to speak with you and your viewers and readers, because you are really the finger on the pulse of not only our community, but what's happening globally. So bringing these issues to your audiences are just so critical. So thank you for having me. Yes, I was born in Iran and I stayed until the age of 10 when our family was forced to emigrate because of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. This moment, and I'm so glad you started with the Jewish community. In fact, I'm writing an op-ed right now that we'll get hopefully booked tomorrow or the day after. You know, we're all been glued to our television sets and our phones and social media, looking at really kind of two split screens. One is what's happening in Israel to the civilian populations, the bombings. The other is what's happening in Iran. What is Israel doing? What is it targeting? I really want to argue that we need to have a third dimension, which is the Jewish community of Iran. And it kind of gets overlooked. You know, we can't forget that outside Israel, the Jewish community of Iran is the largest Jewish community left in the Middle East. And it dates 2,700 years. It's ancient. And it has always been between Iraq and a hard place since the 1979 revolution. There have been many instances where Jews of Iran, like today, had to come out on the streets, had to condemn Israel, had to call out the United States as the great Satan. And so really personifying kind of the classic captured community behavior. And so today it is no different. And in some ways, maybe the hardest it has been for the community since the 79 revolution and the Iran-Iraq war, which again, the Jewish community wasn't targeted specifically, but there was war in Iran when Iraq invaded Iran. So this moment, Nadine, thank you for bringing attention to them. I personally have not been in touch with anyone personally, but we have a couple of data points, Nadine. Number one, the two competing chief rabbis of Iran. And I say competing because historically, one thing that the Iranian government, all Iranian governments have allowed is for each faith community to select their own chief rabbi or head of the community. In the last few years, for the first time, the regime imposed a chief rabbi onto the community. And so this chief rabbi, who is Iranian, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, American-born, American-trained, kind of in the Chabad tradition, which is not authentic to the Iranian community, but lives in Tehran today and speaks on behalf of the community. Both he and the other rabbi, Rabbi Nazarian, who is more, I would say, authentic to the community, have both been forced to put out statements condemning the Israeli attacks, reiterating that the Jewish community of Iran is part and parcel of the Iran and of the people of Iran, and really, on one hand, calling out the atrocities that Prime Minister Netanyahu is committing against the Iranian people, and on the other hand, paying respect to the martyrdom of the Iranian officials who've been killed. So again, very classic reaction by a captured community where they don't have the freedom to share their views freely.
So speaking out against Israel.
Yes, very much so. Condemning vociferously and condemning Prime Minister Netanyahu, calling it a rape and barbaric act. And this is not the first time. So the community has no choice but to do that. And I would argue that there are other communities like the Turkish community and others who've had to do the same in past instances and crises with Israel.
Well, this brings me to what kind of support really is there for this regime in Iran today? I mean, obviously there's support on paper, but how deep is the support? And I guess one of the particular things that I've been thinking about are the young people in Iran who have only lived under the clerics and who don't remember life before 1979 when the Islamic Revolution occurred. So I'm wondering what your sense of this is.
Well, survey research doesn't help us here much because they're largely unreliable in some ways. So we don't have very exact sense what the Iranian people are feeling at this moment. And it is a complex picture. There's no question that there is large swaths of the Iranian population that are deeply, deeply unhappy with this regime. And you can take anywhere from political oppression to economic corruption to the treatment of women. And we know that we've heard a lot about that in the last decade and even more recently. So there's a lot of discontent among Iranians. In the past, during the Green Revolution uprising, we found that most of that discontent was centered in large cities among the higher educated. So when you go into the villages and you go to areas with lower socioeconomic standing and also lower literacy, and where religiosity is higher, you do tend to find support. There's whole segments of Iranian community that are Iranian society that are completely benefiting and beholden to the handouts that the regime gives. So they are obviously supporting the regime. I think at this moment, and this is something both the Americans and the Israeli policymakers understand very well, is the notion of rallying around the flag effect. There's a lot of concern about what Israel's targeting, the symbolic nature, even killing Khamenei himself might be kind of producing that kind of a rally around the flag effect. So it's a mixed picture, but there's no question that what we see on social media coming out of Iran is a lot of welcoming of what Israel's doing, a lot of kind of unhappiness with the regime and its oppression, and that everybody sees this as a kind of opportunity. Now, no question that diaspora Iranians are all welcoming this. And Nadine, something that came out of October 7th that I think was the biggest surprise is that really the only allies, the only strongest community globally that stood with Israel publicly in demonstrations were diaspora Iranians. So we definitely have that shared common interest in getting rid of this, horrible, horrible regime that was responsible for October 7th, as well as so many other malign behavior to their own people in the region globally. So there's a lot of welcoming of support on social media. If you listen to Farsi language influencers and others, they're cheering, they're thanking the Israeli government. But that doesn't mean that there's not segments of the Iranian community that both want the clerical rule because of their religiosity or somehow are dependent on the current regime and therefore they don't want that shattered.
Do you see there's any possibility really? I guess let's talk about how deep the support is for the regime change. And if Israel does go and push, for example, to assassinate Khomeini and other leaders, um, do you foresee or feel as if the Iranian people would really be able to press ahead and find new leaders? Are there new leaders that you don't know about on the horizon?
Well, regime change is a complex matter, and I think both policymakers in the US and in Israel understand that toppling of Khamenei is not just about killing him. It takes a lot more. And even more importantly, what comes after is something that needs to be considered. So that is already a big question anyway. As for other leaders that could step in, right now, the only diaspora leader in the diaspora that has a lot of name recognition and some support is Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who has really forcefully in the last 2 or 3 days pushed on his social media and through many interviews on Fox News and other places, really encouraged the people of Iran to rise up. And so he is the one name that you hear at demonstrations and anti-government, anti-regime demonstrations in Iran. There was a moment with the Women Life Freedom movement where there were about 4 or 5 leaders in the diaspora who came together, Nadine, and held one press conference at Georgetown University. They came together, they united in forces. These were all opposition leaders in their own way. Masih Alinejad, who is a feminist anti-regime activist who had multiple attempts at her life where the regime sent people to kidnap her and kill her. So she was among that group. There's a Canadian gentleman whose wife and 2 daughters were killed in the airliner that was shot down by the Iranian regime. He has become a very important opposition leader. So there was a moment where 4 or 5 key opposition leaders in the diaspora came together to unite, to write a constitution, to envision what the day after this regime might look like in terms of democracy. But again, as it's always happened, the regime has very effectively brought, the cleavage among them, attacked them by saying and putting out rumors that one or the other actually is being paid by the regime. So the regime knows how to sow division very effectively, and it's done so for 45 years. But I would say today, probably Reza Pahlavi, sitting here in the US, has the most recognition, and his name, is shouted in football stadiums and in demonstrations.
Hmm. And is it your sense that, I guess no one really knows this, but have the Israelis, I mean, they're talking about regime change. I mean, obviously there's lots of downsides as the United States has discovered to regime change. But is it your sense, have you talked to anyone that gave you any idea that there's actually a plan there for regime change and also a post-war plan here?
Well, I have no inside information in terms of the thinking of the Israeli leadership, Israeli government. I know that today and starting last night already, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been putting out messages that we don't need to stop with that, and that regime change is a viable thing. And again, I don't know if that's just political posturing. As we saw even before the beginning of this round of conflict, there was a lot of political scheming and posturing between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So we don't really know what's what as outsiders, and I don't really have any, real information from Israeli leaders in terms of their plans. I am sure that all Western leaders, including the US, Europeans, and Israel, are thinking about what if. What if this regime falls? Because there's no question, Nadine, that at this moment, the Iranian regime is at its weakest that it's ever been, perhaps going back to the Iran-Iraq War, where at that time, Ayatollah Khomeini, said that we will drink the chalice of poison and accept kind of ending the war because Iran was in such a bad state. So this is a very weak moment for this regime. There's a lot of rumors on social media about planes leaving Iran filled with family and assets, money by regime officials who are feeling threatened at this moment when all the airports are closed. So when you see an airplane in the air, you know that these are very connected people to the regime. And so this idea of day after is something that is on everyone's mind, but I would be careful about getting ahead of ourselves. This regime has proven itself quite resilient, quite pragmatic. We've seen that in the last day, President Trump has made several references to the fact that the regime has been, through proxies and others, reaching out, asking for negotiation, coming back to the negotiation table. And its desperation shows, but its number one goal is survival. So it will do whatever it takes to survive, even if it means giving up enrichment of uranium for their nuclear capabilities. Now, for them, that is their lifeline. It is a very important weapon for the regime to have, because they saw what happened to both Gaddafi and what happened in Iraq when they lost their nuclear capability. They have learned a lesson of what's happened in the region. But at this moment, if they have no other choice, Khamenei is pragmatic. He's older. He's in his mid 80s. There's rumors that he's not doing well, but they've been saying that for a long time. So the pragmatism of this regime leads me to believe that they do have that survival instinct, and they will do what it takes to maintain their power. And so we'll see. We'll see, what President Trump will do. We'll see what the Israelis allow and how far they'll go in their current bombing. There's a lot to be determined still.
But isn't, obtaining nuclear power and nuclear bomb really kind of like a prime directive, one would say, of this regime? I mean, this is and
Yeah.
and if they had that bomb, I'm wondering, like, what cities would they destroy?
Well, as I said, because they saw what happened to some of their neighboring countries after they lost their nuclear capability, and they saw what happened to North Korea, by the way, after it gained its nuclear capability, and Pakistan and India. So, that speaks to them in ways that nothing else will. They're going to try their utmost not to lose their capacity to enrich uranium and to create a nuclear bomb. But again, depends on how bad it gets for the regime. And if they really feel that they have their back against the wall, and with one push, America can get involved, provide the the B-2 bombers that will be really the deep penetrating kind of bombs going after their Fardo nuclear site. So a lot still needs to be determined, but looks like President Trump wants them back at the negotiating table. President Trump wants this war ended pretty quickly, and he wants to come out looking like the savior. And so he will push this regime to give up its nuclear. And that was even within the Trump administration, there was divisions among those who said that, whether enriching uranium should be the deal breaker or not. But in the last words about it, before Israel attacked Iran, President Trump said Iran will not be allowed to enrich uranium and have nuclear capabilities. So the road to this conflict was very, very questionable. And I, as someone who cares deeply about what happens to this regime and not wanting to have a nuclear capability, we were all very nervous about the negotiations that Witkoff was doing and others, going down a very similar path to the Obama administration, like desperately looking for a deal, desperately and any price looking for a deal. And if that meant allowing this regime to have any even civilian, enrichment capability, that should have been a no deal at all. And I was worried that the administration was divided on it. So Israel has
Like
changed that
Netanyahu,
dynamic.
it looks like Israel took that into its own hands. So
Absolutely, absolutely.
we'll see.
Understandably so, because it was too dangerous to leave it to, the Vance team versus, the more hawkish part of the Trump administration. And so I think that's why the Israelis realized we need to do something ourselves.
So I have another question. So are you surprised by the extent of the Mossad presence in Iran? Um, It's
I
pretty
think
amazing.
I was not surprised, honestly. You know, Iran is not a monolithic, homogeneous society. It is a very diverse society. You know, Nadine, I told you that I visit North Korea. I visited Pyongyang. That is a society that is so homogeneous that that's when you can have totalitarian control. Like you can't breathe because everybody looks the same, has the same faith, has the same beliefs. They're not even geographically, there's not that much difference among the people of North Korea. Iran is so diverse, it is so complex, the complex society. So I am not surprised. And given the corruption on one hand, and the disaffection on the other. There are plenty of Iranians who would more than willingly help Israelis do what they need to do. So either through economic incentives, financial incentives, through political, disenchantment with their government. There's plenty of ways to find room to build a whole factory in the middle of Tehran, as you saw in the middle of that building. I mean, we're still amazed by the ingenuity of the Israelis, go from the beeper incident against the Hezbollah to now what we've seen, the level of information intelligence gathering that the Israeli government has, the Israeli IDF has, is just amazing, but not surprising.
Doesn't seem to be reciprocal to the same extent.
Right. Well, Nadine, being here in Los Angeles with such a large Iranian community, there are instances where, by the way, we, the Iranian community, become suspicious of those here. And I can tell you there's a lot of information sharing with FBI and others. So the regime does have their own spies or cells in the West, in Los Angeles. They've been caught, taking photos. They've been caught transmitting, very highly sensitive information. So they try, and I'm sure they've been successful in ways that we haven't known in the past always. But the level of what the IDF and Israel's intelligence and Mossad has been able to deliver, that's unsurpassed. I mean, there's just no comparison. It's just unbelievable. You saw that one building where I think the head of RGC was killed, like literally went into the bedroom and killed, and the whole building is there except for the hole in the wall. So that is really mind-blowing.
Well, there actually have been a number of arrests in Israel, and that have and including
Of
I read
Israelis.
yeah, Israelis, including I read, and I only read it in one place, but a 13-year-old boy.
Yes.
So
There've been, in the last year, there have been at least 6 or 7 who've been arrested, Israeli citizens who were spying for the Iranian regime, mostly for financial reasons. Look, this is a sensitive issue. Even Iranian Jews leaving Iran and coming to Israel to emigrate, there's always worry and concern because their families remain behind, and a lot of times not out of ideological reasons, but out of blackmail and threats to their families who are behind, they're forced into providing intelligence and information for the Iranian regime. So this goes on in that world that, like, we don't even want to know about the underworld of intelligence gathering and spy office, but it's definitely happens on both sides. And you can imagine what happens in Turkey when every side meets there, or in Vienna. These are like hotbeds of spies and all kinds of information gathering going on.
So are there some good sources for Americans to be following to really kind of have a better understanding of what's going on in Iran? I mean, obviously
Absolutely.
there's a lot of coverage, but I'm just wondering what you read. Is there something?
Yeah. Well, for me, it's important to read both the anti-regime Iranian media that's in the diaspora. And for that, I highly recommend Iran International. This is a media outlet that is largely funded by the Saudis. They're very anti-regime, but they have amazing journalists and resources to gather information. So
And it's in
Iran,
English. It's in
it's
English.
all in English. Iran International. They have Instagram. They're on X, and they have their own website, and they're very up to date. So, for example, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, if I'm not mistaken, will be giving an interview to them. They have huge viewership. Another one that's a little smaller, but again, digital, is called Manoto. It is it's an Iranian Iranian-funded diaspora Iranian media site, Manoto, which is much more authentic. It is very much getting information from people on the ground in Iran. So they're not having like journalists, they're not like CNN, where Iran International functions like a major media company. Manoto is a much more authentic. Manoto means me and you in Farsi, by the way. It means me and you, so it's very authentic. And then there are opposition figures, both like Reza Pahlavi and Masih Ali-Nejad, who are always putting out videos that are sent to them by Iranians in Iran. So a major act of kind of civil discourse and is by videos that are sent from Iran to these opposition figures. And so you will see that when there are planes going in the air, they'll say, see, these are the regime functionaries escaping. So they are collecting, they're citizen journalists essentially, sending their videos to some of the opposition figures, and then they'll platform it on their sites. There's another organization called Nufti, Nufdi. They are a DC-based think tank, and they put out very good, reliable analysis and information. There are a number of think tanks that do a really good job. That's really more on the scholarly side. And then in Israel, INSS, for those of you familiar, has very good analysis. They have Iran specialists. Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, all have centers on Iranian studies. So they have specialists who are looking at all the issues right now. There's a lot of good research of experts who've been looking at this for, 40 years, 40, 50 years, and now really have the depth to be able to understand and analyze what we're seeing.
Are there places where you can read things that are from the regime?
Absolutely. So on X, on Twitter, Press TV is the English language mouthpiece of the Iranian regime. And they have it also in Spanish. They have it in French. I mean, it comes in like 30 languages. So Press TV, and it's always having live programming on X. So they're very, very active. This is separate from Khamenei's own Twitter or X account. So Press TV. There are, I would say, analysts in the US who are very much pro-regime. Trita Parsi is someone who was the founder of an organization called NIAC, NIAC, which was always very pro-regime. They didn't admit it ever, but they always pushed the regime line. He was forced out. He's part of the Quincy Institute now, and he's been on CNN, and he's definitely kind of pushing still an anti-US, anti-West, anti-American, anti-Israeli line, and kind of saying, take it easy on the Iranians. This is hurting the civilians, even though obviously Israel is not targeting civilians in any way. So their voices, even on major media that I know of, who are very much for decades.
I've interviewed him. Yeah.
Oh, Trita, well,
Yeah.
you know. So yeah, he's one of those bad guys.
That's fascinating. Okay. Just what are the Iranians watching and reading? I mean, obviously there's not a free press, a real free press, but there seems to be a lot of coverage. I mean, a lot of things coming out of Iran. I mean,
Nadine, did you see what happened today?
Yes.
You saw what Israel bombed?
I did. Is that the main source of information?
Yes. This was very important. I mean, I had people from Iran writing to me, please, please tell the Israelis to bomb the National Broadcasting Center of Iran.
Really?
And as the bomb hit, the woman who was on live was saying, oh, there's all these lies about how successful the Israeli Mossad has been and how successful their bombing has been. All of it is lies. All of it is lies. As she said with her finger, if you look at the video, she has her finger and she's saying all of this. The bomb comes on top of her and she has to run out. Look, I don't want any civilian killed in anything, innocent, I should say innocent civilians, but she's part of the regime, and she's been, one of the many, many mouthpieces of this regime, providing not only disinformation, misinformation, lies, but also oppressing. There was a lot of requests, many, many asked for that national broadcasting to be a target. It was interesting to me, of all the places that Israel could target. This was one of the biggest requests because they have a very strong control. Now, you know that all of Wi-Fi's were cut off. There was no internet. Elon Musk, the one good thing that he has done in a long time was he enabled Starlink. So there is still connection and communication, which is very valuable. As I said, all these citizen journalists can be sending videos out. But this was a very important thing for the people of Iran to know that the regime will lose its main vehicle for sending information, messaging, and oppressing.
What role does VOA, their Persian bureau, I mean, I mean, I obviously they've been out of business for a little bit, but they had a huge following. I think I read somewhere 4.5 million people were following it. What role has that played? And is there, is there kind of a counter voice that people can obviously follow either on the internet in Iran?
I think the cutting off the funding of VOA was really a disservice. I think it was sad for so much of this work that Western media and Western governments have had in place since World War II, and they played such instrumental roles over the last 80 years. VOA was an important voice. I think today Iranians are so adept at getting access to media. Iranian population, even more than I would say other neighboring countries, are probably the most media savvy and tech savvy. And so they have access not just to the BBC and kind of traditional media, but if you see the kind of stuff that's on Instagram right now, on Telegram channels, it is just mind-boggling. They are using their voice in very, very strenuous ways and strong ways, and they're being heard. So they're getting the information out, they're getting information in. If you look at the fashion on the streets of Tehran, you'll see they're not missing a thing. I mean, it's amazing the kind of haircuts and the kind of clothing and the kind of plastic surgery that goes on. They are fully in line with the rest of the world, and so they get information and they get their messages out very effectively. And I think this attack on the broadcasting system was really fascinating to me, that held so much value for the opposition within Iran, that they really wanted that put out of its commission and not able to continue to spread all the lies, and really an important kind of attack on the regime. They saw this as an important pillar of this regime.
There does seem to be quite a bit of confusion in Iran. Very little guidance about where to go, where to be safe.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
they're
And
just,
the fact that
they're
there's no
unbelievable.
shelters.
What?
There are no shelters in Iran.
Yeah.
The juxtaposition between the Iranian people coming out, and when something is hit, they have nowhere to go. There is absolutely zero consideration for the safety of the citizens. If anything, kind of like what we saw in Gaza, unfortunately, probably the regime wants more civilians killed, sadly. But there's really no consideration for that. And that kind of juxtaposition of how much the Israeli government does to protect its citizens versus what the Iranian regime does vis-a-vis its own citizens, another data point of the difference between these two governments and these two countries.
I just want to clarify that obviously that the VOA has brought back its Persian bureau.
Oh, is it back online?
So they rehired everyone. I don't know how much of it is back online, but it is.
Well, I'm glad to hear you're updating me now. I didn't know. I hadn't heard about that.
However, it's still, there's so many more people at the VOA to really require to really do the kind of coverage that they wanted. I think they're bringing back with 76 staffers for this particular bureau, but there's a much greater support that's necessary for this bureau to be doing its job.
Well, at least you give me a piece of good news, at least even in skeletal form, that the fact that it will hopefully come back online and be a source of information for the people of Iran. Again, the history of VOA is so important, and we have our parents and grandparents all who have gone through periods of listening, sitting by the radio, the only source of information they had. So I'm glad to hear that somebody has realize that this is an important source of information for the people of Iran. I'm glad to hear that.
So is there something that you see happening, before we wind up? Is there something that you see happening that really no one else has been talking about that you've been thinking about?
I guess just zooming out a little bit, we've gone through 20 months since October 7th. And in those 20 months, you and I have spoken so much about anti-Semitism and about Israel and kind of making Israel into a pariah. So much of the anti-Israel sentiment had been that Israel is illegitimate and criticizing and really attacking Israel's very existence. I think what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 days is kind of the rest of the world sit up and not only pay attention to Israel's capabilities, not only recognize that Israel is the military, essentially powerhouse of the Middle East, that nobody can come close to it. But the fact that even the French reluctantly finally came out and said Israel has a right to defend itself. So this narrative that Israel is alone, that Israel is isolated, that Israel is a pariah is not true. I think we have to, especially as a Jewish community around the world, recognize that, narratives can stick and we can start believing them ourselves. I don't know if you saw what happened at the Paris air show, the military air show. Did you see what happened?
Nope.
So this is an annual show of different arms makers from around the world coming
Yeah.
together.
Mm-hmm.
And initially, they wanted not to allow Israel Aircraft Industries and others to showcase their weapons and their aircrafts and others. It went to the courts in France, and the courts held that they are not allowed to discriminate against one country over another.
Oh, I
So
didn't
they
see that.
allowed,
I didn't know about that court
oh
decision.
yeah,
Okay.
so they allowed the Israeli pavilion to stand. And what happens the night before? The night before the show is open, it opened Monday morning Paris time, today Paris time. They had a huge black curtain surrounding the Israeli pavilion, all surrounded. So segregating the Israeli weapons from all others. And that is the point that I'm trying to make, is that on one hand, they know that Israel is in the front line of fighting a kind of genocidal ideology that the Iranian regime has been pushing for 45 years. It is fighting not only extremism that this regime perpetrates against its own population, but what it's done around the Middle East with all the proxies of Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas, and what is done in Europe and in Africa and in Latin America. So on one hand, they see Israel doing the dirty work and being in the front line. On the other hand, they still want to make Israel the pariah. So that is unfortunately the duality that we live in. But we as Jews have to be careful not to let that sink into our heads. And so we have to hold our head up with pride. What Israel has done in the last 4 days as an Iranian American Israeli, I have to say there's a great amount of pride in it. And there's recognition that the Middle East is a complex region of the world. Will we ever have quiet? I don't know. But the fact that Israel needs to be strong, it needs to defend itself and its citizens, and in fact, through them, all of us, there's just no question about it. So I, as worried as I am, as tumultuous as our world is today, 20 months after October 7th, I have to say that the power, the regime that enabled Hamas to perpetrate those atrocities 20 months ago is being punished, and it is being hopefully debilitated permanently.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. And I look forward to more conversations about this, and I'm sure events are going to be unfolding very fast.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadine, for having me always. And all the prayers and wishes for our Israeli brothers and sisters, the IDF, and everyone who's keeping Israel safe and secure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.